Olivia Brooks, a resilient 34-year-old black woman, has spent most of her adult life fighting for those in society who are vulnerable and often overlooked. A person with inner strength and a fierce will, Olivia frequently appears at community events, where she not only serves as an inspiration, but also as a connector, bringing hope to those who feel invisible in society. Tonight, she had just finished her speech at a major fundraising event for veterans, where she was the keynote speaker. With deeply emotional and sincere words, Olivia moved the audience, sparking discussions about the hardships that veterans, particularly black veterans, face when returning from the battlefield. The gala was filled with a hopeful atmosphere, brimming with promises of donations, collaboration opportunities, and plans for upcoming initiatives. Though Olivia received numerous praises and friendly handshakes, she felt exhausted. For her, quiet moments are when she truly feels herself, away from the spotlight and superficial conversations. On her way home, Olivia decided to pass through a neighborhood she used to frequent when she first began her advocacy for social justice, a place that held memories and a special significance in her heart. It was an impoverished area of the city where she had organized her first community events, igniting change in the lives of the residents there. Though this area wasn't the safest, with recent protests and heightened tension between police and residents, Olivia still felt attached and didn't hesitate to walk through it. The streets lay quietly under the night sky, creating an oddly peaceful atmosphere as she walked confidently. Her soft olive-green dress swayed gently with her steps, contrasting subtly against the dark streets around her. In that stillness, memories of community gatherings, emotional conversations, and the people of this neighborhood resurfaced in her mind, deepening her appreciation for the journey she had traveled. But just as that sense of peace filled her thoughts, the sound of a police car engine broke the silence. A patrol car quietly followed behind Olivia, moving slowly like a shadow. Olivia turned her head, feeling a hint of unease, but maintaining her composure. This wasn't her first time facing such a situation, though the tension still rose within her. She knew that a confrontation awaited, a confrontation that might test her patience and strength once again. Yet, she kept calm, letting no worry show on her face. The police car slowly closed in on her, its flashing lights suddenly illuminating the dark corner of the street. Behind the wheel sat Officer Daniel Harris, a veteran cop who had patrolled this area for years, but held no empathy or concern for its residents. In Harris's eyes, this neighborhood was filled with people unwilling to change, unwilling to rise, and it was a place where he felt punished by having to serve. To him, this was a forgotten part of the city, where he assumed he had absolute authority, doing as he pleased without reporting to anyone. Harris immediately noticed Olivia the moment she stepped into his car's headlights. She stood out with her confident stride, her olive-green dress flowing gently with her steps, a stark contrast to the surroundings. In Harris's eyes, Olivia's confidence and poised elegance seemed unusually unsettling. He wasn't accustomed to seeing anyone in this area, especially a black woman, with such a composed and firm presence. To him, people here were supposed to bow their heads, live in fear, and understand their place whenever they saw the police. Unable to tolerate feeling challenged by Olivia's distinctive presence, Harris decided to stop the car without reporting it, ignoring any formal procedures. Olivia sensed the car's presence and the flashing lights trailing behind her, making her heart beat a bit faster, but she quickly regained her composure. She knew she had no reason to feel afraid. She had faced these baseless stops countless times before, where she was questioned simply because of her skin color. Calmly, Olivia stopped, turned to face the car, and stood upright, hands resting at her sides, ready, yet not confrontational. The police car door opened, and Harris stepped out with a commanding stance, his hand casually resting near his belt, as if prepared to assert his authority at any moment. He approached her, looking her up and down with contemptuous and scrutinizing eyes. His gaze scanned every detail, from the confidence in her stance to the calm in her eyes, which showed no sign of fear. This only served to irritate him further. Harris stopped a step away, his eyes mocking. "You seem quite confident. What are you doing here at this hour?" His tone was harsh and cold, filled with a sense of dominance he assumed he held. Olivia looked him directly in the eyes, her voice steady and unyielding. "I'm just on my way home," she replied briefly, her gaze unwavering. She knew that showing anger at this moment would only give Harris an opening to impose further control over her. However, Olivia's calm response only seemed to agitate Harris more. He glanced her over, smirking, and stepped closer, his voice growing increasingly sarcastic and rude. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place? You don't look like you belong in this area at all. Do you think you fit in here?" Hearing those words filled with disdain, a wave of anger rose within Olivia. But she held back, responding calmly, "I grew up here. I know this place better than anyone." She maintained her composure, even though Harris's condescending gaze disturbed her. Harris scoffed, uninterested in Olivia's explanation. Instead, he added to his mockery, "Oh, so you're well acquainted with the troubles here, I assume." He moved in closer, as if trying to pressure Olivia into showing fear. "But that doesn't change the fact that I want to see your ID. And I want it now." The pressure in Harris's tone and attitude thickened the air. But Olivia continued standing tall, showing no sign of being shaken. She knew Harris had no rightful reason to stop her, but she also understood that pushing back too strongly could escalate the situation. Taking a quiet, steady breath, Olivia reached into her bag and carefully retrieved her wallet, each motion slow and deliberate, ensuring Harris had no excuse to claim she was acting suspiciously. The officer watched her every move intently, his eyes sharp and cautious. Harris leaned forward slightly, as though prepared to react the moment he perceived anything unusual. The tension wrapped around them, making the air feel almost still. Olivia felt the weight of Harris's scrutiny, but she reminded herself to remain calm. She knew that staying composed and unflinching was crucial, because any sign of unease could be interpreted as guilt. She had mentally prepared for confrontations like this, but reality always proved more challenging than theory. Quickly assessing her next steps, she braced herself for any questions Harris might throw her way. As she pulled out her ID from her wallet, Olivia recalled a friend's advice, a former lawyer, on handling these sudden stops by the police. "Always cooperate, but don't give up your rights. Without valid cause, they can't arrest or charge you," her friend had said. Olivia knew Harris lacked legal grounds to hold her, but his ambiguous and tense demeanor left her wary. This wasn't just a simple ID check. It felt more like an informal interrogation, where her every move was under scrutiny. Olivia opened her wallet, took out her ID, and handed it to Harris in a composed manner. Her gaze didn't waver, though she felt a slight unease inside. Harris studied her ID intently for a moment, then looked up, his eyes piercing as if trying to probe any hidden secrets behind her calm gaze. He asked unexpectedly, "Where were you last night, Olivia?" The sudden question took Olivia by surprise, but she quickly recovered, responding in a steady, emotionless tone. "I was at a friend's house," she said concisely, withholding details. She knew that in situations like this, saying less was the best way to avoid getting trapped in an endless cycle of questions. Still, she also knew that her brief answer might make Harris suspicious and prompt further questioning. Sure enough, Harris didn't let it slide. He continued probing. "Can you prove that?" Olivia looked directly at him, unfazed. "If necessary, I can call my friend to confirm. But as far as I know, you have no legitimate reason to question or request that from me." Olivia's response was confident, yet polite, maintaining the necessary decorum. Harris raised an eyebrow, showing his displeasure, but couldn't refute her. This was a silent battle between the two, where every word and gaze carried weight. Olivia knew Harris might be searching for a misstep, a slight error he could exploit, but she trusted her ability to remain controlled. The tension lingered for a few seconds before Harris reluctantly returned her ID. "You seem very sure of your rights, Olivia," he said, his voice laden with insinuation. Olivia gave a slight nod, revealing no emotion. "I know my rights, and I know that I have no reason to fear if I've done nothing wrong." Olivia continued to stand firm, her expression calm and steady, her eyes unwaveringly fixed on Harris. She didn't want to show any sign of fear or unease. Deep down, Olivia understood that her silent stance, her lack of resistance, was her way of maintaining control and demonstrating her resilience. Yet her calmness seemed only to fuel Harris's anger. He was unaccustomed to others, especially a black woman, meeting his gaze without any trace of fear. He felt challenged, as if his authority had been rendered powerless. Harris stepped forward, his expression darkening with anger and aggression. Unable to control himself, he suddenly kicked Olivia's leg, causing her to lose balance and fall hard onto the ground. The fall was painful. Her knee struck the concrete, and her palms were scraped as she tried to brace herself from hitting the ground face first. Sharp pain coursed through her, but Olivia bit her lip and held back any complaint, refusing to show weakness. She kept her face as composed as possible, showing Harris that his actions could not break her. Though her body was throbbing with pain, Olivia held onto her composure. Slowly, she lifted her head, meeting Harris's icy glare with her unyielding gaze. There was no weakness or hesitation in her eyes, only defiance, as if to tell him that he couldn't intimidate her. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her voice soft but filled with strength and resolve. Her words rang with authority, momentarily catching Harris off guard. But his surprise quickly turned to renewed irritation, unable to accept being challenged in this way. To Harris, Olivia was nothing more than someone daring to disrupt the rules of control he thought he alone commanded. Olivia's mind drifted back to her difficult past, filled with challenges that laid the foundation for her resilience today. As she faced Harris's gaze, memories of her relentless struggle resurfaced. Those were her early days when she was a young woman confronting discrimination and outdated social prejudices. She remembered being dismissed and underestimated because of her gender, her background, and her ideals. Instead of avoiding these obstacles, Olivia chose to confront them. She worked twice as hard, proving her capabilities and gradually dismantling the stereotypes that had existed for so long. Her mind also flashed to the people she had encountered and overcome along her journey. There were allies, roadblocks, and those who tried to tear her down just to protect their positions. From these challenges, Olivia learned patience and a calm resolve that bordered on coldness. She realized that true strength didn't just come from winning or losing, but from the ability to stand firm through adversity, to protect herself with unwavering determination. Now, Olivia was no longer the inexperienced young woman she once was. She had learned to master her emotions, hold on to her dignity, and resist anyone's attempts to devalue her worth. Standing before Harris, her calm and confident demeanor was not only a reflection of her inner strength, but also a powerful message to those trying to subdue her. She would not back down or yield. Every look, every word, every gesture conveyed one truth: human rights are inviolable. In Olivia's heart, her belief in herself surged, and she understood that this calmness was her greatest weapon. Without shouting, without force, merely by standing her ground, she had already won. While Olivia maintained her composure, Harris's anger continued to boil over. He looked at Olivia, as though desperately searching for a way to break her. The resolve in Olivia's eyes was like a spark he could not extinguish, only intensifying his rage and hatred. Yet this time, Olivia no longer felt threatened as she had at first. She realized she was no longer alone in this battle. She represented a community she had dedicated herself to protecting, the embodiment of countless resilient women, refusing to be trampled under the weight of prejudice. Taking a deep breath to center herself, Olivia slowly stood, brushing off the dust and scratches on her hands without looking away from Harris. Her gaze remained resolute, silently communicating that he could not make her crumble through brute force. Harris glared at her, his pride wounded, outraged at being challenged by someone he deemed inferior. His sense of authority had been violated, and for a moment, Harris stood still, speechless, as though unsure of what to do next. Olivia felt the shift within herself. She recognized that she was not just a victim of senseless oppression, but a person who could stand up against it. A surge of inner strength reminded her of the ideals and struggles she had and would continue to uphold. She was not someone who would easily be broken. Instead, she was a determined woman, a symbol of freedom and justice, who would never allow someone like Harris to take that away from her. Despite the pain still gripping her body, Olivia remained calm and continued standing tall, unshaken in the face of the person confronting her. Olivia remained standing, weary and in pain, but unyielding, her gaze unwavering. Just as the tension hit its peak, the familiar hum of an engine came from the end of the street. She recognized Lucas's car, her brave husband, a former soldier who had served in some of the world's most dangerous regions. His arrival felt like a burst of light in the darkness, filling Olivia with a renewed sense of hope and reassurance. She knew that with Lucas here, things might change, and she would no longer be alone in this standoff. Lucas stepped out of the car, tall and steady, exuding a quiet confidence. Under the dim streetlight, his rugged frame and sharp gaze reflected the presence of a man who had endured intense battles. He observed Olivia from afar, noticing the scrapes on her hands and knees, and immediately, his protective instinct kicked in. His years in the military had taught Lucas to remain calm and cautious, but his eyes now flared with anger at seeing his wife treated unjustly. Olivia met Lucas's approach with a look of unwavering trust and pride. She knew he would protect her with everything he had. Lucas walked slowly toward Harris, his strides deliberate, yet carrying an unspoken strength, each step affirming his natural authority. Harris, who had just moments ago assumed himself the dominant force, now felt outmatched by an opponent who was his superior in both physical presence and resolve. A flicker of surprise crossed Harris's face as he met Lucas's cold gaze, the unmistakable look of a man who had faced countless dangers and conquered them. "What's going on here?" Lucas's voice was calm, yet commanding, a quiet warning that he wasn't someone to be easily intimidated. Harris faltered, attempting to assess the man before him, struggling to hide his unease. But he couldn't mask the brief hesitation in his eyes. Within Lucas's gaze, Harris saw not just calmness, but the formidable strength of someone who could not be easily subdued. "This is my jurisdiction," Harris replied defiantly, trying to reassert his authority, but with a trace of shaken confidence in his voice. "You think you can come here and order me around? This isn't your military, buddy. This is my territory." Lucas maintained a cold, unyielding smile, a smile devoid of friendliness, one of a man who knew his strength and didn't need words to prove it. He met Harris's eyes, his stare piercing and unwavering, making Harris feel wholly overpowered. Lucas didn't need to raise his voice or show any aggression. His calmness alone was enough to overshadow Harris. "This is my wife you hurt and injured," Lucas said, each word echoing like thunder in the stillness. "And I suggest you stop before this goes too far." Harris tried to keep his hardened expression, but hesitation was clear in his eyes. Lucas's commanding presence made him feel small, as though the power he had long wielded was slipping away. But Harris's arrogance and pride wouldn't let him back down. He muttered, trying to maintain a defiant tone. "Do you know who you're talking to? I have authority here, and I can take both of you in whenever I want." Lucas remained unfazed, silently observing Harris with a firm gaze. His eyes held a calmness that bordered on intimidation, as though he had seen situations like this countless times and knew he would come out victorious. He took another step forward, making Harris instinctively step back, realizing he was facing a man who wouldn't be easily subdued. "You think you can threaten me?" Lucas asked, his voice still warm, yet infused with undeniable authority. "I didn't come here to argue. But if you don't back down and stop this abuse of power, I assure you, you'll regret it." Harris hesitated, his initial confidence entirely diminished as he faced someone as resolute as Lucas. Lucas's calm wasn't mere patience. It was the strength of a man who had weathered far more dangerous confrontations and wasn't easily rattled. Harris realized that he was up against not just a former soldier, but a man ready to protect his family at any cost. Harris's sense of authority felt under grave threat, and he understood that he was losing control of the situation. The atmosphere between them thickened, as though all other sounds had disappeared, leaving only the oppressive weight of tension in each breath. Both Harris and Lucas stood facing each other in dangerous silence, their eyes locked in a silent, heated exchange. Harris tried to maintain his composure, his lips pressed tightly together as he held back any words that could worsen the situation. But deep within his eyes, Lucas could still see the fear and instability that had overtaken Harris, a man once so self-assured, now stripped of his control. In contrast, Lucas stood firmly, his gaze sharp, like a blade ready to cut through Harris's facade. He didn't need words to convey his stance. His silent presence was a clear declaration that he wouldn't compromise. Lucas knew Harris was the type to submit before strength, and he wanted Harris to understand that if necessary, he would go all the way to protect what mattered. Harris could feel the threat in Lucas's eyes, each of Lucas's strong, steady breaths acting as a warning. He began to back away slightly, trying to create distance, but Lucas's eyes never left him, tracking his every move. Harris realized that his usual tactics and manipulations were useless here, in the face of someone whose conviction couldn't be shaken. For so long, Harris had relied on pressure and deception to control others. But now, standing before Lucas, he felt frozen, powerless against Lucas's unbreakable strength and determination. Olivia stood nearby, acutely aware of the tension between the two men. Relief and pride surged within her as she watched Lucas. She knew that the man beside her would never allow anyone to threaten him or those he loved. Every look and every move Lucas made radiated resolve and protectiveness. To Olivia, he was the fortress she could lean on, a man not only strong, but also ready to fight for her. His presence filled her with a sense of safety and security, something she rarely felt in her challenging life. Gratitude washed over Olivia, though tinged with worry. She knew Harris wasn't the type to let things go easily. His retreat today didn't mean it was over. Instead, it could be the start of a chain of retaliations. She feared for Lucas's safety, but she also knew she couldn't let this fear cloud his resolve. She silently hoped Lucas would stay vigilant and wouldn't let anything stand in the way of his determination. As if sensing her thoughts, Lucas turned to Olivia, his gaze softening. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, as if to convey reassurance and a promise that everything would be all right. It was more than just a promise. It was a silent commitment from a man ready to stand up for what he loved. Olivia nodded slightly, a faint smile appearing on her lips despite her lingering worries. But at least, she knew that with Lucas by her side, she would never have to face the threats of the world alone. Harris glared at Lucas, his eyes brimming with anger and wounded pride. The idea that his authority was being challenged by a man he deemed unworthy was unbearable. The calm confidence Lucas exuded left Harris feeling threatened, a sensation he rarely experienced. Harris's eyes darkened, and unable to control his rage, he drew his baton, raising it as a warning. "Who do you think you are? Coming here and telling me what to do?" he demanded, his voice sharp as he tried to reassert his control. Lucas remained unfazed, his gaze steady and unwavering. With the experience of a soldier who had faced countless dangers, Lucas knew that staying composed and in control was paramount in moments like these. Seeing Lucas's calm confidence only intensified Harris's anger. Without hesitation, Harris charged forward, swinging his baton with full force in an attempt to strike Lucas. But Lucas swiftly sidestepped, his movement sharp and precise, like a seasoned warrior. He caught Harris's wrist, and with a powerful motion, twisted Harris's arm, causing him to lose his balance. Harris stumbled, shocked by the speed and control with which Lucas countered his attack. Lucas held Harris firmly, effortlessly overpowering him. Without excessive force, Lucas demonstrated that real strength. And authority don't come from a baton or a badge, but from true skill and determination. Harris, now pinned to the ground, struggled to break free, but Lucas's hold was unrelenting. Olivia watched in amazement and pride as Lucas easily subdued the man abusing his power. Yet she noticed the dangerous glint of shame and fury in Harris's eyes. Humiliated by his defeat in front of the very woman he sought to intimidate, Harris's rage intensified. Refusing to accept this loss, he reached for the radio on his belt, shouting in frustration, "Requesting backup! Officer under attack!" Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the air, flashing red and blue lights flooding the street. Police cars screeched to a halt beside them, officers stepping out, their faces marked by confusion and concern as they saw Harris restrained by Lucas. Though bruised and breathing heavily, Harris stood up, straightening his uniform with forced pride. Pointing directly at Lucas, he shouted with authority, "Arrest him immediately! He attacked me and resisted an officer." The other officers eyed Lucas with a mix of hesitation and suspicion. They noticed his calm demeanor, void of hostility, as he stood unflinching, as if he knew his actions were justified. Yet, under Harris's forceful command, they had little choice but to approach and handcuff Lucas. Olivia's heart sank at the sight, worry welling up inside her, though she knew Lucas wouldn't let this injustice last. Lucas, embodying the calm resolve of a man who had faced countless trials, did not resist as the officers closed in. He allowed them to cuff him, his gaze steady, a silent declaration that he would fight to the end for justice and for the woman he loved. As they led Lucas toward the patrol car, Olivia felt her heart grow heavy. She knew this was far from over, and that they both would face even greater challenges ahead. While being led away, Lucas looked back at Olivia, his eyes filled with determination and a silent promise that he would not let her endure this injustice alone. Harris stood nearby, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes as he watched Lucas being handcuffed, though beneath his victorious expression lay a seed of fear. He realized that Lucas was not someone who would back down easily, and Harris couldn't ignore the potential repercussions of Lucas bringing the truth to light. Even as he was taken to the patrol car, Lucas felt no fear. He knew he had the connections and the means to fight back against the injustice Harris was trying to impose on him and Olivia. He reminded himself that this was merely the beginning of a larger battle, and he was ready to confront whatever came his way to defend justice and truth. As Lucas was escorted into the police car, Olivia stood there, feeling a surge of worry and anxiety engulf her. Memories of all the times Lucas had stepped up to protect others, despite the dangers to himself, suddenly resurfaced in her mind. Watching the resilient man she loved being handcuffed and taken away as if he were a criminal, Olivia felt a deep sense of helplessness and pain. Although she knew Lucas to be calm and strong, she couldn't help but feel afraid, not only for him, but also for what they were up against, a system riddled with injustice and abuse of power. The sound of sirens echoed as the police car roared off, taking Lucas away and leaving Olivia standing alone in the dark with her worries and questions about what lay ahead. Inside her, thoughts swirled continuously, from anger to dread. She felt furious at a system that had protected people like Harris for so long, and deeply frustrated at the thought of her husband possibly facing this injustice. She knew Lucas wasn't one to give up easily, and neither was she. But despite her determination, she couldn't stop herself from feeling confused and uncertain about the path forward. As she stood there in the unsettling silence, Olivia felt her fear intensify. She wondered what would happen if Lucas wasn't released. Would they be able to overcome this? She knew Lucas was a man of strong will, someone who wouldn't be easily subdued. But the thought of him detained, trapped within cold prison walls, made her heart ache. The image of him being handcuffed, his calm gaze before being led away, it all seemed like an endless nightmare, haunting her thoughts. Olivia felt powerless, unable to do anything for Lucas at that moment, and this only fueled her resolve to fight for their justice. She recalled Lucas's words about courage and resilience in the face of hardship. "Nothing is scarier than standing still and not taking action," he had once told her. Those words served as a reminder, but they also weighed heavily on her. She knew that Lucas had prepared for the situation, that he believed in justice and fairness. But Olivia also understood the risks they were facing and the system they were up against. More than anyone, she knew it wasn't easy to demand fairness from a place where injustice had become deeply ingrained, especially with people like Harris, who wielded power to crush others. On her way home, Olivia's worry only intensified. Every sound, every streetlight reminded her of Lucas and what he might be going through in his cell, facing a system rife with abuse. She couldn't stop thinking about how to protect Lucas, how to help him fight against these absurd accusations. She knew that without her support and battle on the outside, Lucas might face even greater difficulties. Walking into their quiet, empty home, Olivia felt a sense of loneliness and loss. Without Lucas by her side, everything seemed to lose its usual warmth and security. She sat down, resting her head in her hands, exhaling deeply as she tried to focus. Inside her, a new source of strength began to rise. Olivia realized that if Lucas couldn't fight freely, she would be his representative, his voice for those who had been oppressed. She knew she couldn't let Lucas bear this injustice alone. He had courageously defended the community, and now she would defend him. She would stand beside him in this fight, no matter the challenges ahead. The more she thought about it, the stronger her resolve became. She knew what she had to do, not only for Lucas, but also for everyone else who had been ignored and oppressed in society. Olivia understood that their battle was not a solitary one. It was a fight for justice, for hope, and for a future where good people no longer had to bow before power. Lucas was taken to the precinct in heavy silence. During the drive, he focused on organizing his thoughts, letting logic guide him instead of emotion. He knew that to navigate this situation, he needed not only patience, but also meticulous control over every word and action. At the station, Lucas was led into the interrogation room. The glaring overhead light beamed down on him, and the small, windowless room only heightened the intensity. Yet, Lucas remained cool and composed, showing no sign of unease. He understood that, to the officers, this arrest might appear to be routine, but to him, it was part of a larger scheme. The interrogation began with basic questions, but Lucas quickly sensed that they were fishing for more details about his recent activities. Remaining sharp, Lucas carefully selected his responses, mindful of not revealing too much while also avoiding suspicion. He was well aware of his rights and used his legal knowledge to protect himself from invasive questions about his personal life and relationships. After several tense hours, he was taken back to a holding cell. Once he had the chance, Lucas requested another phone call, this time reaching out to an old intelligence colleague. This friend not only understood the workings of police operations, but also had access to information that could help Lucas in his current predicament. Their conversation was brief but effective, as his friend quickly grasped the situation and promised to dig deeper to provide Lucas with relevant information. After hanging up, Lucas began to strategize his next moves. He suspected his arrest might be connected to recent projects he'd been involved in. One, in particular, involved an investigation into a powerful corporation, and Lucas knew he might have been ensnared in a trap set by those determined to block justice. For this reason, he had to act with caution and wisdom. Lucas was not alone in this fight. His years in the military had forged a network of loyal comrades and friends, always ready to assist when needed. Besides calling his lawyer and the intelligence contact, he also reached out to friends in the media. He knew the influence of the press could create significant pressure, forcing the police to act transparently and responsibly. As night fell, Lucas sat in the cell, his gaze steady as he took in his surroundings. He understood that every action and reaction could be observed, so he maintained a guarded composure. His thoughts were not only on the current situation, but also on safeguarding his loved ones, particularly Olivia, who was out there waiting, burdened by worry. A plan began to take shape in his mind. He knew that as long as he could stay focused, facing every challenge with poise, nothing could shake his resolve. Moreover, Lucas believed that his arrest would draw the attention of influential figures. It might just be the opportunity to expose the truth behind the conspiracy against him. Just then, a young officer paused outside his cell, glancing at him with a hint of hesitation. After a moment, the officer spoke softly. "I know who you are, and I believe you haven't done anything wrong." Though it was only a quiet remark, it brought Lucas a glimmer of hope. Perhaps not everyone in the precinct was complicit, and he might even find an ally within the system. Lucas gave the officer a faint, appreciative nod. In that brief exchange, he realized there were still those who stood on the side of justice, willing to seek truth despite challenging circumstances. Lucas knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with determination and the support of friends, he would prevail. As the hours passed, Lucas carefully thought through each step, plotting out his next moves in detail. Finally, he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and mentally prepared for the long battle ahead. Though he was confined, his spirit remained unbroken. In the stillness of the cell, Lucas knew he was still in control. Meanwhile, Olivia, though filled with worry, refused to let herself sink into fear. She knew Lucas was prepared for scenarios like this, and she trusted in his abilities. But Olivia also understood she needed to prepare herself for this fight. Upon arriving home, Olivia received a call from Carter, a lawyer Lucas had previously arranged. Carter was an experienced attorney, known for taking on cases challenging police misconduct. Olivia and Carter met promptly and exchanged essential information. Carter wasn't just a skilled lawyer. He was also deeply familiar with the inner workings of the legal system, particularly in complex cases involving law enforcement. Carter explained that their strategy would not only defend Lucas against baseless charges, but also seek to expose the truth, proving Harris's abuse of power. Carter didn't rely solely on legal arguments. He also planned to use his extensive network within the press to bring public attention to the case. "We don't just need to win in court," he told Olivia, his voice resolute. "We need to win public support. I'll make sure this story doesn't get buried." Hearing this, Olivia felt some of her anxiety lift, knowing that Carter and Lucas had a comprehensive strategy. Carter explained that he'd already begun investigating Harris's background and intended to uncover any past incidents of misconduct. "I doubt this is the first time Harris has crossed the line," Carter added. "If we can find any indication of previous abuse of power, it will be key in defending Lucas and proving his innocence." Carter's investigation quickly progressed. He leveraged his legal contacts and began reaching out to individuals within the community who had previously been targeted by Harris. Carter managed to connect with several people who had suffered from Harris's discriminatory and abusive behavior, but had never spoken up out of fear or lack of evidence. Their accounts were documented, adding substance to the case and further illuminating Harris's true nature. While Lucas maintained his confidence in the holding cell, he remained focused on how best to respond. He knew patience was essential. By staying calm and letting Carter lead the investigation, Lucas was certain that justice would ultimately prevail. But he was also aware that this wouldn't be a quick or simple battle. Olivia and Carter maintained constant communication, ensuring each step was taken with precision and timeliness. Under Carter's guidance, they began gathering evidence, collecting statements from witnesses previously victimized by Harris, and preparing to bring the case into the public eye in the most impactful way. The fight for Lucas and Olivia wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight to expose the truth, to reclaim justice not only for themselves, but for everyone who had suffered similar injustice. Thomas's investigation entered a critical phase. With the support of Olivia and Lucas, he delved deeply into the history of Officer Daniel Harris, determined to uncover every instance of misconduct throughout Harris's career. Thomas understood that exposing Harris wasn't merely a way to protect Lucas. It was a chance to bring to light the corruption embedded within a system that enabled abuse of power. Starting with Harris's professional records, Thomas leveraged his connections in the legal world to access internal documents from the police department. The revelations were shocking. Harris had a long history of violent and racially biased conduct. His file was filled with complaints from the community regarding his treatment of Black individuals and other marginalized groups, from unjust stops to physical abuse and verbal insults. Harris had been reported numerous times for abusing his authority and violating human rights. However, many of these complaints had been buried or dismissed by the police department. Thomas realized that Harris wasn't an isolated case, but rather a symbol of a police culture that shielded individuals like him from accountability by silencing complaints. This discovery only strengthened Thomas's resolve to bring Harris to justice. Olivia and Lucas played an active role in the investigation. Olivia began reaching out to people in the community who had suffered under Harris's oppressive tactics. Stories emerged as more people felt compelled to share their painful experiences. Some described being stopped on the street solely due to their skin color, while others recounted incidents where Harris had used unnecessary force. Yet, fear or a lack of faith in the system had kept many of them silent over the years. Thomas knew that to make this case undeniable, he needed solid evidence. He started seeking witnesses who could testify about Harris's misconduct in previous cases. A key lead emerged from an older case where Harris had used excessive force against a young Black man. This case had been covered up by powerful figures within the police force. However, Thomas located witness statements from that incident, which became a crucial piece in building a case against Harris. Thomas also reached out to human rights organizations and journalists to ramp up the pressure on the system. News articles began to circulate, exposing not only Harris, but also the police department's long-standing practice of covering up his misconduct. Media involvement quickly gained momentum, and the public's attention turned toward the case. The stories didn't merely focus on Harris's abuses, but highlighted how he was part of a police culture riddled with racism and unchecked violence. With these revelations, Thomas gained a significant advantage. He knew that the police department could no longer shield Harris without facing backlash from the public. Mounting community pressure, combined with clear evidence of Harris's misconduct, forced the police into a difficult position. They now had to choose: either continue protecting Harris and risk reputational ruin, or admit wrongdoing and bring him to justice. From his cell, Lucas followed the developments with a calm, unwavering sense of hope. He knew this battle wouldn't be easy, but with Thomas's tenacity and Olivia's strong support, he believed that justice would prevail. Lucas also used this time to prepare his testimony, ensuring he had a solid argument for when the case went to court. Thomas, along with Olivia and Lucas, crafted a powerful counter-strategy. They didn't rely solely on legal evidence, but utilized media influence and public opinion to bring the case to light. By connecting with organizations and journalists, they created an intense wave of scrutiny on the police department, forcing them to reconsider their approach to handling the case. Finally, an internal investigation into Harris's behavior was launched under intense public pressure and mounting evidence. Investigators were left with no choice but to thoroughly examine every aspect of the accusations, interviewing former victims and scrutinizing each charge. This move was not only an attempt to meet public demand, but also a step toward restoring trust in law enforcement. The investigation promised not to stop at Harris, but to peel back layers of long-concealed injustices within the system. Lucas and Olivia were not fighting just for themselves. They stood against a powerful, flawed system that had caused harm far beyond their own lives. Their courage had shaken an institution once seen as untouchable. With each word and each action, they stirred public interest, transforming their pain into a beacon of hope for those who had been oppressed. They were determined to keep going until justice shone its light into the darkest corners of the system Harris represented. The persistence of Lucas, Olivia, and Thomas ignited a new movement, a call for transparency and accountability within public institutions. This was no longer a personal fight. It had become a symbol of the struggle for human rights and justice within society. With every step forward in the investigation, hope grew, not only for Lucas and Olivia, but for all who believed in change. Their actions inspired others to find the courage to speak out against the injustices they had endured. They became a voice for those who couldn't speak, a symbol of hope for those overlooked by the system. With their determination, they set a crucial precedent. No one is above the law, and all abuses of power will be held accountable, regardless of status or rank within the system. The outcome of this battle would not only impact the lives of Lucas, Olivia, and those directly involved, but also signal a new chapter in police accountability. If the investigation revealed complicity among officers or groups within the department, it could lead to systemic reforms, demanding a shift in both practice and mentality within the force. Lucas and Olivia's fight demonstrated one undeniable truth. In a just society, no one should be able to exploit their power to oppress or control others. They fought not only for themselves, but for all who had been marginalized, aiming for a society where justice and truth would never be silenced or buried by dark forces. Olivia and Lucas's story quickly became the focus of public attention, spreading powerfully throughout the community. The evidence of Officer Harris's abusive and discriminatory behavior sparked widespread outrage. For many, this case was not an isolated incident, but a representation of long-standing injustices and abuses of power within the police system. Human rights organizations, journalists, and thousands of citizens rose together, demanding justice not only for Olivia and Lucas, but also for all victims of discrimination and violence. Protests erupted across the city. People raised signs demanding justice, chanting, "End abuse of power," and justice for Olivia and Lucas. Voices from all walks of life united, growing into a larger movement of those who believed that this was the time for change. They didn't just oppose Harris. They called for a comprehensive reform of the police force, emphasizing that they would not tolerate any further protection for those who abuse their power. The mounting pressure from the public and the media placed the police department in a difficult position. Olivia and Lucas's story continued to dominate news outlets and social media, spreading public outrage like wildfire. Journalists began digging deeper, investigating Harris's past and uncovering systemic issues within the police force. Stories of Harris's violent and discriminatory behavior surfaced, with witnesses stepping forward to share their own experiences. Thomas, Olivia, and Lucas's attorney maximized the power of public outrage. He recognized that this was not just a legal battle, but a fight for the minds and hearts of the public. Appearing in interviews, holding press conferences, and delivering powerful statements, Thomas emphasized the importance of standing up and demanding transparency from the system. "This case isn't just about Olivia and Lucas," he declared. "It's about all of us. We must stand against a system of abuse that we've tolerated for far too long." As the pressure intensified, the police department could no longer ignore the evidence and the allegations. Top officials faced tough questions from reporters and social groups. Under public scrutiny, they were forced to launch an internal investigation into Harris's actions, revisiting every case he had been involved in. This investigation extended beyond Olivia and Lucas's incident to numerous other complaints about violence and racial discrimination, which had previously been ignored. The police department began to feel the impact of public pressure and the serious erosion of trust. They couldn't shield Harris without facing severe reputational consequences. Senior officials worried that failing to handle the case seriously could tarnish the credibility of the entire system. Under this pressure, they decided to suspend Harris and other colleagues connected to the case while the investigation proceeded. Olivia, too, began speaking out in interviews, sharing her story openly with the media and refusing to be silenced by injustice. In one deeply moving interview, she shared, "We're not asking for any special privileges. We just want to be treated fairly and protected by the law like every other citizen. This isn't just our story. It's the story of all who have suffered injustice." Her words struck a chord with many, stirring empathy and solidarity within the community. Meanwhile, Lucas, though still detained, followed the developments closely from within his cell. He knew this battle had grown far beyond a personal one. It had become a community movement against abuse of power. Former military friends and legal allies continuously sent him messages of support, pledging to stand by him and Olivia in this fight. Lucas felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude for the unity shown by the people around him. The community's faith and support fueled his resolve and determination to see justice through. Under pressure from the public and social organizations, authorities were compelled to conduct a rigorous investigation. Evidence of Harris's misconduct emerged more clearly, from baseless stops to allegations of violence and discrimination. The fact that Harris had repeatedly abused his authority, sometimes with the tacit protection of fellow officers, ignited outrage not only within the community, but also within the police force itself. Thomas, Olivia, and Lucas worked tirelessly to bring the truth to light. They weren't just defending themselves. They aimed to hold the police force accountable. With the support of public sentiment and witness testimony, they gradually built a solid case, making it increasingly impossible for the department to cover up Harris's actions. This evidence not only protected Olivia and Lucas, but also put immense pressure on those who had concealed and enabled Harris's abuses. The fight between Olivia and Lucas had now transformed into a symbol of the movement for justice. By confronting and resisting injustice, they had helped catalyze change. Their unwavering solidarity, the strength of the community, and the power of justice and resilience had opened a door to a new future, where equal rights and fair protection could become a reality for all citizens. With the overwhelming force of public opinion and irrefutable evidence, the police department was left with no option but to confront the truth and take responsibility for the misconduct. Proposals for systemic reforms, from improving procedural accountability to ensuring transparency, began to surface. Olivia and Lucas's determination, alongside Thomas's relentless advocacy and the community's support, inspired hope that injustices within the system would be gradually eradicated. Their journey demonstrated that in a just society, no one could exploit their authority to oppress or intimidate others. They had fought not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been sidelined, paving the way for a society where justice and truth would prevail over darkness and deceit. After a long and arduous battle, Harris was finally held accountable for his misconduct. He was dismissed from the police force, facing multiple charges related to abuse of power and discrimination. His history of violent and racist behavior, hidden for years, was finally brought to light thanks to the perseverance of Olivia, Lucas, and their community. As they watched Harris being led away, Olivia and Lucas felt a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. They had embarked on this journey not only to expose the truth, but also to protect the community from the dangers posed by those entrusted with maintaining order. Holding Harris accountable was a milestone, but they knew it was only a small victory in a much larger struggle. They still had a long road ahead in challenging a system that had long been deeply ingrained and difficult to change. Olivia felt a sense of relief, knowing her efforts hadn't been in vain. From interviews and evidence gathering to sleepless nights, strategizing against Harris and his enablers, everything had led to this moment. Yet, alongside her satisfaction, was a growing concern for the future. She knew many others like Harris were still lurking in the shadows, and that this system wouldn't collapse with just one revelation. Lucas, on the other hand, felt a mix of frustration and determination. To him, Harris's arrest was a long overdue consequence. Over the years, Lucas had seen countless innocent people suffer, oppressed by those who abused their authority and perpetuated discrimination. While he was relieved to see Harris face justice, he knew punishing a few individuals wouldn't fix the underlying problems. One bad apple doesn't spoil the bunch, Lucas thought, aware that more bad apples were likely to appear unless the system was made to correct itself. Their fight was far from over, and Olivia and Lucas knew it. Questions and concerns weighed heavily on their minds. Would their actions be enough to prevent similar cases in the future? How would they continue fighting to ensure their initial gains weren't lost? They recognized that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, as these biases and abuses of power were woven deeply into society. But they weren't alone. With them stood the support of their community and like-minded individuals. As for Harris, though he had been dismissed and faced legal repercussions, the impact of his actions lingered. Many in the community continued to bear the trauma and fear instilled by Harris and those like him. Removing Harris from the police force couldn't erase the harm he had caused, but it was a clear warning that those who abused their power could no longer hide forever. Looking back, Olivia and Lucas realized that this event was about more than just bringing one individual to justice. It sparked a wave of awareness throughout the community, encouraging others to stand up and fight for their rights and the rights of others. This realization renewed their belief that no matter how challenging the road ahead might be, they wouldn't be facing it alone. They understood that their actions weren't only for today, but for protecting the future of coming generations. On that day, as they left the police station, Olivia and Lucas carried with them both a sense of hope and responsibility. They knew they would need patience, perseverance, and the willingness to face even greater obstacles. Determined, they vowed not to stop until the system underwent real reform so that no one else would have to endure the suffering Harris and others like him had caused. Upon returning home, Lucas decided to use his military experience to further the cause of reform. No longer content to simply stand by, he wanted to become an active part of the movement against abuse of power and discrimination in the police force. Organizing meetings with activists and human rights organizations, Lucas shared his story and spread a message of patience and determination for justice. He knew his actions alone wouldn't change the system overnight, but he believed that every step he and Olivia took would make a difference, however small. As a survivor of Harris's abuse, Olivia quickly became a voice for those who hadn't been able to speak out. She began participating in social forums and community organizations, meeting with people who had suffered under the system's abuse, and encouraging them to come forward. Olivia understood that sharing her story was not only a means of demanding justice for herself, but also a way to inspire others. "If we don't speak up, this wrongdoing will continue," Olivia stated in a public forum. "We can't wait for others to change the system. We have to stand up and do it ourselves." With Thomas's legal support, Olivia and Lucas continued investigating other cases of misconduct within the police force. They discovered that many people had been mistreated, oppressed, and degraded at the hands of those who abused their power, with no chance to seek justice. These victims, from the elderly to the young, from immigrants to individuals of diverse backgrounds, had all been marginalized by a system that exploited their vulnerabilities. Olivia and Lucas resolved to seek justice for these individuals, pushing for substantial reform measures from the authorities. With his experience and legal acumen, Thomas helped Olivia and Lucas compile a detailed case file to present to the city council, demanding action. He also assisted them in connecting with human rights organizations and the press, ensuring that the story stayed in the public eye and that pressure on the police department remained high. "Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoers," Carter emphasized at a press conference. "It's about protecting future victims." Throughout this journey, Olivia and Lucas found growing support from the community. Many who had previously suffered from police abuse reached out, sharing their painful stories and helping to create a powerful and united movement. Those who had once lived in fear and oppression now had a support system, a place to rally together in the fight for justice. Olivia and Lucas spent countless hours attending community meetings, organizing talks to help people understand their rights, and learning how to defend themselves. The movement expanded beyond the city, gaining national attention from leaders, lawmakers, and human rights organizations. Lawmakers began considering new legislation to enforce transparency and accountability within the police force. Thanks to Olivia and Lucas's unwavering efforts, proposals for reform, such as human rights training for officers, independent oversight bodies, and public reporting of misconduct records, were being discussed at multiple levels of government. Lucas didn't stop participating in the movement. He sought to bring change from within. He began studying police procedures, focusing on internal regulations against abuse of power and discrimination. Determined to be a part of the reform process, Lucas applied to join an organization monitoring police activities to prevent abuses like those perpetrated by Harris. Meanwhile, Olivia continued meeting with social advocacy groups and victims of police violence. She encouraged others who had been through similar experiences to find the strength to come forward and demand justice. "If we stay silent, we're only helping them hide the truth," Olivia said. "They can't hold on to their power when we stand together and refuse to back down." Both knew the path ahead would be challenging. They would face opposition from those invested in the old order, officials afraid of losing power, and individuals intent on exploiting the system for personal gain. But they also understood that each small step offered hope to others. Olivia and Lucas were committed to seeking justice, not only for themselves, but also to create a safer, fairer environment for everyone. The conclusion of the legal battle with Harris wasn't the end for Olivia and Lucas. Instead, it was the beginning of a much longer journey, one of relentless fighting to uphold the rights of all people, especially society's vulnerable members. With determination and resilience, Olivia and Lucas continued their mission, steadily building faith in the vision of a just system. Their story became a source of inspiration for countless others, from those who had endured injustice to young activists filled with passion. Olivia and Lucas were no longer just victims. They had become symbols of the fight for justice, exemplifying the strength of perseverance and unyielding spirit. And so, with every determined step, Olivia and Lucas opened a new chapter, filled with hope on their journey toward justice and a society free from injustice. This story truly leaves a lasting impact. The prejudice and injustice that Olivia endured, alongside her husband's steadfast intervention, highlights that sometimes justice must come from within ourselves. What do you think about the way her husband handled the situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this video if you found the story meaningful, and subscribe to our channel to catch more compelling content in the future. See you next time.
The summer sun beat down on Maple Street as the scent of grilling burgers wafted through the air. The Martinez family's annual 4th of July barbecue was in full swing, with laughter and chatter filling their backyard. Little did they know that this cherished tradition was about to become the epicenter of a neighborhood conflict that would expose long-simmering tensions and ultimately reveal an unexpected twist. Carlos Martinez stood at the grill, expertly flipping patties as his wife Maria set out colorful plates of corn on the cob and potato salad. Their children, Alex and Sophia, darted between clusters of relatives and friends, their excited giggles punctuating the festive atmosphere. It was a scene of pure suburban bliss, one that Carlos had worked tirelessly to create for his family since moving to this quiet cul-de-sac 3 years ago. But not everyone on Maple Street welcomed the Martinez family with open arms. As the party hit its stride, a commotion erupted at the front of the house. Carlos's smile faded as he heard a familiar voice raised in anger. With a sigh, he handed the spatula to his brother-in-law and made his way through the throng of confused guests. There, on the sidewalk, stood Harold Thompson, the thorn in the Martinez family's side since day one. The retired accountant's face was flushed red, not from the heat, but from the fury that seemed to consume him whenever he laid eyes on his Latino neighbors. "This has gone on long enough," Harold bellowed, jabbing a bony finger in Carlos's direction. "You people and your loud music, the smell of your food, it's bringing down property values." A hush fell over the gathering as guests crowded around to witness the confrontation. Carlos took a deep breath, determined to keep his cool despite the familiar sting of Harold's words. He dealt with prejudice before, but never so openly, never in front of his entire family and friend group. "Mr. Thompson," Carlos began, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "We've been over this. We have every right to celebrate with our loved ones. If you have concerns, we can discuss them civilly another time." But Harold was beyond reason. Spittle flew from his mouth as he ranted about noise ordinances and threatened to call the police. Some of the guests began to murmur uneasily, while others stepped forward to defend the Martinez family. The joyous atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a thick tension that seemed to crackle in the air. As the situation escalated, Maria appeared at Carlos's side, her eyes flashing with a mixture of hurt and determination. "Enough," she said firmly, addressing Harold. "You've made your feelings clear time and time again, but this ends today." There was something in Maria's tone that gave even Harold pause. She turned to the gathered crowd, her voice rising with emotion. "Friends, family, I'm sorry you had to witness this, but maybe it's time everyone knew the truth about our neighbor Mr. Thompson." Carlos's eyes widened in surprise. What truth? He thought he knew everything about their ongoing feud with Harold, but the look on his wife's face told him there was more to the story. Much more. Maria took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. Harold Thompson isn't just a grumpy old man with outdated views. He's... But before Maria could finish her sentence, a commotion from down the street drew everyone's attention. A police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, their faces grim as they approached the group. "We received a noise complaint," one officer announced, eyeing the crowd warily. "Is there a problem here?" The moment hung in the balance. Carlos and Maria exchanged a loaded glance, silently debating how to proceed. Harold, for his part, looked triumphant, certain that his threats had finally come to fruition. But then something unexpected happened. From the back of the crowd, a voice rang out, one that Carlos recognized as belonging to Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow who lived across the street. "Officers," she said, her voice quavering but determined, "I think there's something you need to know about Mr. Thompson and his history in this neighborhood." A ripple of whispers spread through the gathering. Even Harold's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of what looked almost like fear. As Mrs. Chen made her way to the front of the group, Carlos felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Whatever was about to be revealed, he realized, would change life on Maple Street forever. The annual 4th of July barbecue had become the stage for a long overdue reckoning, one that would force everyone present to confront their own biases and assumptions. The officers looked from Mrs. Chen to Harold, then back to Carlos and Maria. "All right," the lead officer said, pulling out a notepad. "Let's hear what's really going on here." And so, as fireworks began to pop in the distance, celebrating America's independence, the residents of Maple Street prepared to grapple with a different kind of independence. Freedom from the prejudices and secrets that had divided them for far too long. Carlos took Maria's hand, squeezing it gently. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As Mrs. Chen began to speak, her words carried on the warm summer breeze. Carlos couldn't help but wonder, how would their lives change once the truth was finally laid bare? And more importantly, would their tight-knit community survive the revelation? The story of the 4th of July barbecue that changed everything was just beginning to unfold, and as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Maple Street, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Mrs. Chen's voice quivered as she began to speak, her eyes fixed on Harold Thompson. "I've lived on this street for over 40 years, she said. "I've seen families come and go, watched children grow up. But I've also seen the darker side of our community, the side we don't like to talk about." The gathered crowd leaned in, hanging on her every word. Even the police officers, who had arrived ready to break up a noisy party, now stood transfixed by the unfolding drama. "Mr. Thompson wasn't always the angry man you see today," Mrs. Chen continued. "When he first moved here with his family, he was different. Quieter, perhaps, but not unkind. It wasn't until the Jacksons moved in next door to him that things changed." Carlos felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm evening air. He heard whispers about the Jacksons, an African-American family who had lived on Maple Street briefly before the Martinez family arrived. But he'd never known the full story. Mrs. Chen took a deep breath before continuing. "The Jacksons were good people. Their children played with ours. They kept their home beautiful. But Harold, he couldn't see past the color of their skin. The comments started small at first. Snide remarks at neighborhood meetings, complaints about imaginary noise. But it escalated." As Mrs. Chen spoke, Carlos noticed Harold's face growing paler by the second. The man who had been so full of righteous anger just moments ago now looked small, almost frail. "One night," Mrs. Chen said, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper, "there was an incident. Vandalism, horrible racist graffiti on the Jacksons' house. We all suspected, but no one could prove." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Carlos felt Maria's hand tighten in his own. One of the police officers cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are you saying Mr. Thompson was responsible for a hate crime?" Before Mrs. Chen could respond, another voice cut through the tense silence. It wasn't just vandalism. All eyes turned to see Brian Foster, a high school history teacher who lived 2 doors down, step forward. "I was just a kid then, but I remember that summer. The accidents that kept happening to the Jacksons' property, the threatening phone calls. It got so bad they eventually moved away." Harold, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly found his voice. "You can't prove any of that," he sputtered, his face now ashen. "This is slander, all of it." But the floodgates had opened. More neighbors stepped forward, sharing long-buried memories of that turbulent time. The picture they painted was one of a community paralyzed by fear and complacency, allowing hatred to fester unchecked. As the stories unfolded, Carlos couldn't help but draw parallels to his own family's experiences since moving to Maple Street. The cold shoulders, the whispered comments, the sense of always being watched, it all took on a new, more sinister meaning. Maria, sensing his distress, squeezed his hand. "This isn't just about us anymore," she whispered. "This is bigger than our family." Carlos nodded, realizing she was right. The annual barbecue had become a catalyst for long overdue change. But as he looked around at the shocked and angry faces of his neighbors, he wondered if their community could survive the weight of these revelations. The police officers, looking increasingly uncomfortable, huddled together in quiet discussion. Finally, the lead officer addressed the crowd. "Clearly, there's more going on here than a simple noise complaint. We'll need statements from everyone involved." Harold, seeing the tide turning against him, attempted to make a hasty retreat. This is ridiculous, he blustered, backing away. You can't believe these people over me. I'm a respected member of this community. But his words rang hollow. The mask had slipped, revealing the ugliness that had lurked beneath the surface for so long. As Harold turned to leave, he found his path blocked by an unexpected figure. Alex, Carlos and Maria's teenage son, stood before him, eyes blazing with a mix of anger and determination. "Mr. Thompson," Alex said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly bubbling beneath the surface, "I got something to say to you." A hush fell over the gathering. Carlos felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. He and Maria had raised their children to stand up for what was right, but confronting a grown man, especially one as volatile as Harold, was no small feat. Alex took a deep breath before continuing. "Every day since we moved here, I've watched you glare at my family. I've heard the things you say when you think we can't hear. And you know what? It hurt. It made me feel like I didn't belong in my own neighborhood." Harold's face twisted into a sneer, but before he could interrupt, Alex pressed on. "But then I realized something. The problem isn't with me or my family. It's with you. You're so caught up in hate that you can't see what you're missing out on. You don't know how awesome my dad's grilling is, or how my mom makes everyone feel welcome. You don't know that I just made honor roll, or that my sister volunteers at the animal shelter." Alex's words seemed to strike a chord with many in the crowd. Nods of agreement rippled through the gathering, and Carlos saw several neighbors wipe away tears. "So yeah," Alex concluded, his voice growing stronger, "you can keep being angry if you want. But you're the one who's going to end up alone. The rest of us, we're going to keep coming together, keep celebrating, keep being a real community. And you're welcome to join us, if you're ready to open your mind and your heart." For a moment, the only sound was the distant pop of fireworks. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause began, growing into a thunderous ovation. Carlos pulled Alex into a fierce hug, his heart swelling with pride. As the clapping died down, all eyes turned once again to Harold. The man who had seemed so formidable just hours ago now looked deflated, almost lost. For a brief moment, Carlos thought he saw a flicker of something: regret? Shame? Cross Harold's face, but then the familiar scowl returned. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," Harold muttered, pushing past Alex and storming off down the street. As they watched him go, Carlos felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: relief that the truth had finally come to light, anger at the years of prejudice his family had endured, and a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this could be a turning point for their community. But he also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Confronting decades of ingrained bias and hidden prejudices would take more than one dramatic showdown. As the neighbors began to disperse, talking in hushed, excited tones about the evening's events, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. What would tomorrow bring? How would this revelation change the dynamic on Maple Street? And most pressingly, what was the secret that Maria had been about to reveal before Mrs. Chen spoke up? As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky and the sound of fireworks grew louder, Carlos knew one thing for certain: life on Maple Street would never be the same again. The question was, would it change for the better? As the night wore on, the Martinez family's once festive backyard became a hub of intense discussions. Neighbors who had barely spoken beyond polite hellos were now engrossed in deep conversations, sharing stories and confronting uncomfortable truths about their community's past. Carlos found himself in the middle of it all, fielding questions and trying to process the evening's revelations. He couldn't help but notice the way some neighbors looked at him differently now, with a mixture of guilt, sympathy, and something that looked almost like admiration. Maria, meanwhile, had retreated to the kitchen, busying herself with cleaning up. Carlos knew his wife well enough to recognize when she needed space to think. Whatever secret she had been about to reveal about Harold Thompson was clearly weighing heavily on her mind. As the last of the guests trickled out, promising to stay in touch and continue the important conversations that had begun that night, Carlos finally had a moment alone with Maria. He found her standing at the sink, staring out the window into the darkness. "Hey," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You want to talk about what happened out there?" Maria turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Carlos, I don't know if I did the right thing. Maybe I should have just kept quiet." Carlos pulled her into a hug, feeling the tension in her body. "What do you mean?" What were you going to say about Thompson before Mrs. Chen spoke up? Maria took a deep breath, steeling herself. Do you remember last month when I was working late at the community center? I overheard a conversation. Harold was there, arguing with someone. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but... She trailed off, and Carlos waited patiently for her to continue. Whatever Maria had heard, it was clearly something big. He was talking about selling his house, Maria finally said. But not to just anyone. He said he had found a buyer who would keep the neighborhood the way it should be. Carlos, I think he's been actively trying to prevent diverse families from moving onto Maple Street. Carlos felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by a wave of sadness. The depth of Harold's prejudice seemed to know no bounds. We have to do something, he said. We can't let him manipulate who gets to live here. Maria nodded, but her expression remained troubled. There's more, she said quietly. I think he might have dirt on some of the other neighbors. He mentioned something about keeping people in line. What if exposing him makes things worse for everyone? As they grappled with this new information, a soft knock at the back door startled them. Alex poked his head in, his face uncharacteristically serious. Mom, Dad, there's something you need to see. Exchanging worried glances, Carlos and Maria followed their son out into the yard. A small group had gathered near the fence, whispering urgently. As they approached, Carlos saw what had caught everyone's attention. A crude, threatening message had been spray-painted across their back fence. Go back where you came from, the red letters screamed in the darkness. Carlos felt his stomach drop. He'd dealt with prejudice before, but never something so blatant, so close to home. He instinctively moved to shield Maria and Alex, even as he knew the real damage had already been done. I called the police, Brian Foster said, stepping forward. This is unacceptable. After everything that came out tonight, for someone to do this. As if on cue, the whoop of a police siren cut through the night air, but instead of bringing relief, it only added to the tension. Would the police take this seriously, or would they dismiss it as a prank, another misunderstanding, in a long line of incidents the Martinez family had endured? As they waited for the patrol car to arrive, Carlos noticed movement across the street. Harold Thompson stood in his driveway, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. For a moment, their eyes met, and Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. Was this Harold's doing? A retaliation for the events of the barbecue? Or was there someone else in the neighborhood harboring such hateful views? The police car pulled up, and two officers, different from the ones who had responded earlier, stepped out. As they approached, Carlos felt Maria's hand slip into his own. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. But even as he drew strength from his family's presence, Carlos couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The revelation of Maple Street's troubled history had brought long-buried issues to the surface. Now, with this act of vandalism, it was clear that the past was far from buried. As the officers began to take statements, Carlos's mind raced. How could they prove who was behind this? How could they make their home feel safe again? And most importantly, how could they turn this ugly incident into an opportunity for real, lasting change in their community? The night air crackled with tension as neighbors gathered, some offering support, others watching warily from a distance. Carlos knew that the coming days would be crucial. The true character of Maple Street was about to be tested, and the outcome would shape their lives for years to come. As he stood there, arm around Maria, watching the police shine flashlights on the hateful message, Carlos made a silent vow. He wouldn't let fear win. He wouldn't let hatred drive his family from their home. Whatever it took, he would fight for justice, for acceptance, for the right to belong. The battle for Maple Street had only just begun, and Carlos Martinez was determined to see it through to the end, whatever the cost. The days following the 4th of July incident passed in a blur of police reports, neighborhood meetings, and hushed conversations. The vandalism at the Martinez house had shaken the community to its core, forcing residents to confront the ugliness that had been festering beneath Maple Street's picturesque surface. Carlos threw himself into action, organizing a neighborhood watch program and reaching out to local civil rights organizations for support. He was determined to turn this crisis into an opportunity for positive change. But with each step forward, it felt like they were pushed 2 steps back. Anonymous letters began appearing in mailboxes, warning of property values plummeting and the character of the neighborhood changing. Carlos couldn't prove it, but he was certain Harold Thompson was behind them. The retired accountant had been suspiciously quiet since the barbecue, watching from the sidelines as tensions in the community rose. Maria, meanwhile, grappled with the weight of the secret she carried. The knowledge of Harold's attempts to manipulate home sales on Maple Street gnawed at her. She knew she should come forward, but fear held her back. What if exposing Harold's schemes made things worse for her family? As the summer heat intensified, so did the pressure on Maple Street. The community found itself divided into factions: those who supported the Martinez family and pushed for change, those who sided with Harold and his old guard, an uncertain middle group who just wanted things to go back to normal, whatever that meant. The situation came to a head on a sweltering August afternoon. Carlos was in the front yard, touching up the paint on their mailbox, scrubbing away yet another racial slur, when he heard raised voices coming from down the street. Heart pounding, he jogged towards the commotion, only to find a crowd gathering outside the Foster house. Brian Foster stood on his front porch, face red with anger, squaring off against Harold Thompson and a group of other neighbors. "You can't do this," Brian was shouting. "You can't just force people out because you don't like the color of their skin." Harold's voice was calmer, but no less menacing. "Nobody's forcing anyone, Brian. We're simply concerned about maintaining certain standards in our community. If some people can't meet those standards, well..." Carlos pushed his way through the crowd, piecing together what was happening. The Fosters had been planning to sell their house to a young interracial couple, a move that Harold and his supporters were trying to block. "This ends now," Carlos said, his voice cutting through the chaos. All eyes turned to him. "Harold, we know what you've been doing. We know about your preferred buyers and your threats. It stops today." A hush fell over the gathering. Harold's face twisted into a sneer. "You don't know anything," he spat. "You're nothing but trouble, you and your kind. This neighborhood was perfect before you came along." The crowd's reaction was mixed, some nodding in agreement with Harold, others looking ashamed at his blatant racism. Carlos felt a mixture of anger and sadness wash over him. How had it come to this? Just then, Maria's voice rang out from behind him. "Actually, Harold, we know everything." Carlos turned to see his wife striding towards them, a determined look on her face. In her hand, she clutched a folder. "I didn't want to do this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I hoped we could work things out as neighbors, as human beings. But you've left us no choice." She opened the folder, pulling out a stack of papers. Emails, recorded conversations, financial records, all showing how you've been manipulating property sales on this street for years. Steering certain buyers away, pressuring others to sell. It's all here. Harold's face went pale. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't prove anything." "Oh, but we can," came another voice. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her small frame radiating determination. "I've been keeping my own records, Harold. Every incident, every accident, every family that was pushed out. I thought I was powerless to stop it back then, but not anymore." The atmosphere on the street was electric. Neighbors whispered urgently to each other, some looking shocked, others nodding as if pieces of a long unsolved puzzle were finally falling into place. Harold looked around wildly, like a cornered animal. His supporters were backing away, not meeting his eyes. "This is slander," he shouted. "I'll sue all of you." But his threats rang hollow. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Suddenly, the wail of police sirens cut through the air. 2 patrol cars rounded the corner, lights flashing. Carlos felt his heart rate spike. This was it, the moment that would determine the future of Maple Street. As the officers approached, time seemed to slow down. Carlos looked around at the faces of his neighbors, some fearful, some angry, some hopeful. He saw Alex and Sophia watching from their front yard, worry etched on their young faces. He felt Maria's hand slip into his own, squeezing tight. Whatever happened next would change their lives forever. The truth was finally coming to light, but at what cost? And more importantly, would it be enough to heal the deep wounds that had been festering in their community for so long? As the police officers stepped out of their cars, the tension on Maple Street reached its breaking point. The fate of their neighborhood hung in the balance, and everyone present knew that nothing would ever be the same again. As the police officers approached, a hush fell over the crowd. Carlos felt his heart pounding, acutely aware of the weight of the moment. This was it, the culmination of months of tension, fear, and hope. But just as the lead officer opened his mouth to speak, a commotion erupted from the back of the gathering. A figure pushed through the crowd, moving with urgent purpose. To everyone's shock, it was Harold's wife, Eleanor Thompson, a woman who had been conspicuously absent from neighborhood affairs for years. "Wait!" Eleanor cried out, her voice trembling but determined. "There's something you all need to know." All eyes turned to her, including Harold's, whose face had drained of all color. Eleanor took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "Harold isn't acting alone," she began, her words sending a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. "There's a group, influential people in the city, who've been orchestrating this segregation, not just here on Maple Street, but across the whole town." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Carlos felt Maria's hand tighten in his own as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about their neighborhood anymore. It was something far bigger and more insidious. Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "They call themselves the Heritage Preservation Council. On the surface, they claim to protect the town's history and character. But in reality, they're manipulating property sales, influencing local politics, even pressuring businesses, all to keep certain people out and others in their place." The police officers exchanged glances, clearly realizing that what had seemed like a neighborhood dispute was rapidly evolving into something much more serious. Harold, who had been silent until now, suddenly found his voice. "Eleanor, shut up," he hissed, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and fear. "You don't know what you're doing." But Eleanor stood her ground. "No, Harold, I've been silent for too long. What we've been part of, it's wrong. And it ends today." As if on cue, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A well-dressed man stepped out, his very presence exuding authority and menace. Carlos recognized him immediately. Jonathan Blackwell, a prominent real estate developer and one of the most powerful men in town. "What's going on here?" Blackwell demanded, his eyes scanning the scene before settling on Harold. "Thompson, I thought you said you had this situation under control." The pieces were falling into place now. Carlos remembered seeing Blackwell at town council meetings, always pushing for zoning changes that seemed innocuous at the time. Now, with Eleanor's revelation, a sinister pattern was emerging. Blackwell's arrival seemed to embolden Harold. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said smoothly, trying to regain control of the situation. "Just a neighborly dispute that got out of hand. Nothing for anyone to worry about." But the damage was done, the truth was out, and the residents of Maple Street were realizing that they had been pawns in a much larger game. Brian Foster stepped forward, his face set with determination. "No more lies, Harold. No more manipulation. We want the truth. All of it." The tension in the air was palpable. Carlos could see the fear and uncertainty on his neighbors' faces, but also a growing resolve. They had been divided for too long, and now, faced with a common enemy, they were coming together. Blackwell's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of panic. He reached into his jacket, perhaps for a phone, but one of the police officers stepped forward, hand on his holster. "Sir, I'm going to need you to keep your hands where I can see them." As the officer began to read Blackwell his rights, Carlos felt a tugging on his sleeve. He looked down to see Alex, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Dad," he whispered, "I think I found something." Carlos followed his son's gaze to a manila envelope partially hidden under a nearby bush. How long had that been there? And more importantly, what was inside? As he bent to retrieve it, Carlos felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. Whatever was in that envelope, he realized, could change everything. The future of Maple Street, and perhaps the entire town, hung in the balance. With trembling hands, Carlos opened the envelope. As he scanned its contents, his eyes widened. This was it, the smoking gun they needed. But as he looked up at the tense faces surrounding him, a new fear gripped his heart. How far would Blackwell and his associates go to keep their secrets buried? The summer air crackled with tension as Carlos stood at the center of the storm, holding proof of a conspiracy that went far beyond anything they had imagined. The true battle for justice on Maple Street was only just beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. Carlos's hands trembled as he held the envelope's contents. A stack of documents that laid bare the entire conspiracy. Contracts, emails, and financial records painted a damning picture of the Heritage Preservation Council's true nature. It was all there, evidence of discriminatory housing practices, political bribes, and a web of deceit that stretched from Maple Street to City Hall. "Everyone needs to see this," Carlos said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He began to read aloud, his words cutting through the tense silence. As the truth unfolded, gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who had been at odds for months now stood united in their shock and outrage. The scale of the deception was staggering. Blackwell's composure crumbled. "This is absurd," he sputtered, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. "Thompson, do something." But Harold Thompson was a broken man. He slumped to the curb, head in his hands, as the weight of his actions finally caught up with him. Eleanor knelt beside him, her face a mixture of sorrow and relief. The police officers, realizing the magnitude of what they were dealing with, called for backup. Within minutes, more patrol cars arrived, along with detectives and even a couple of FBI agents who had been investigating related cases in neighboring towns. As Blackwell was led away in handcuffs, protesting loudly about his connections and his lawyers, a cheer went up from the residents of Maple Street. It was a cathartic release of months of tension and fear. But Carlos knew their work was far from over. "This is just the beginning," he said, addressing his neighbors. "We've exposed the truth, but now we have to rebuild. We have to make Maple Street, and our entire town, a place where everyone is truly welcome." The response was immediate and heartening. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now embracing, making plans to repaint the Martinez's vandalized fence together. Mrs. Chen offered to host a weekly community dinner to bring everyone closer. Even some of Harold's former supporters stepped forward, shamefaced but sincere in their desire to make amends. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the scene, Carlos felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Brian Foster, looking both exhausted and exhilarated. "I just got off the phone with Aisha and Michael," he said, referring to the young interracial couple he had been trying to sell his house to. "I told them everything that happened. They still want to move here. Said they'd be proud to be part of a community that stands up for what's right." Carlos felt a lump in his throat. This was what they had been fighting for, not just tolerance, but true acceptance and unity. But just as it seemed the day's drama was winding down, a sleek news van pulled up to the curb. A familiar face stepped out. Diana Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter, and a rising star reporter for the local news station. "Mom?" Diana called out, looking confused and concerned. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Chen stepped forward, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Oh, Diana," she said with a smile, "have I got a story for you?" Suddenly, Carlos understood. Mrs. Chen hadn't just been keeping records of the neighborhood's troubled history. She had been building a case, waiting for the right moment to bring it all to light. And now, with her daughter's help, the truth about Maple Street would reach far beyond their neighborhood. As Diana set up her camera and began interviewing residents, Carlos felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Their story would be told, but what would the consequences be? How would their quiet suburban life change once it became national news? Maria squeezed his hand, sensing his unease. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, "we'll face it together. All of us." Carlos looked around at his neighbors, no, his friends, and felt a surge of hope. Maple Street had been through the fire, but they had emerged stronger, more united than ever before. As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Carlos realized that this wasn't just the end of their ordeal. It was the beginning of something new. A community reborn, committed to justice and equality. And as Diana's camera light flickered on, illuminating the diverse faces of Maple Street's residents, Carlos knew that their story had the power to inspire change far beyond their little corner of the world. The battle for Maple Street was over, but the real work, the work of building a truly inclusive community, was just beginning. And for the first time in months, Carlos couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. As Diana Chen's news report hit the airwaves, the story of Maple Street spread like wildfire. What had begun as a local dispute quickly became a national conversation about discrimination, community, and the power of standing up for what's right. The residents of Maple Street found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their experiences resonating with people across the country. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood underwent a remarkable transformation. The physical changes were visible: freshly painted fences, new families moving in, community gardens sprouting up in once neglected lots. But the most profound shifts were happening beneath the surface, in the hearts and minds of the residents. Carlos and Maria's home became an unofficial headquarters for the neighborhood's renewal efforts. Their living room hosted nightly meetings where people shared ideas, worked through lingering tensions, and planned for a better future. It wasn't always easy. Old habits and prejudices didn't disappear overnight, but the willingness to listen and learn was palpable. Harold Thompson, facing legal consequences for his role in the Heritage Preservation Council's schemes, made an unexpected move. In a tear-filled community meeting, he offered a full confession and a genuine apology. "I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "I let fear and ignorance guide my actions, and I hurt so many people in the process. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to be part of making things right." The road to forgiveness would be long, but Harold's sincerity opened the door to healing. He volunteered to lead an initiative to review and rectify past discriminatory housing practices, working alongside civil rights lawyers to ensure justice for those who had been wronged. Mrs. Chen, now hailed as the neighborhood's unsung hero, found herself in high demand. Community groups from across the city sought her advice on building inclusive neighborhoods. She took it all in stride, hosting workshops on cultural understanding from her front porch, always with a plate of her famous dumplings at the ready. Alex and Sofia Martinez became leaders in their own right, starting a youth group dedicated to promoting diversity and equality. Their first project: a vibrant mural on the side of the community center, depicting faces of all colors coming together to form a beautiful mosaic. As summer turned to fall, Maple Street hosted its first ever multicultural festival. The event drew visitors from all over the city, transforming the once quiet suburb into a bustling celebration of diversity. Food stalls lined the street, offering everything from Maria's tamales to Mrs. Chen's dumplings to new resident Aisha's fragrant biryani. Music from various cultures filled the air, and impromptu dance lessons broke out on front lawns. Brian Foster, watching the festivities from his porch, couldn't help but smile. "You know," he said to Carlos, who had stopped by with a plate of food, "a few months ago, I was thinking of moving away. Now, I can't imagine being anywhere else." The festival became an annual tradition, growing bigger and more inclusive each year. But more importantly, it served as a reminder of how far they had come and the work still to be done. The legal fallout from the Heritage Preservation Council scandal continued to unfold. Jonathan Blackwell and several city officials faced federal charges, their trial making headlines and sparking discussions about systemic discrimination across the country. But for the residents of Maple Street, justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers. It was about creating lasting change. They formed a community oversight committee to work with local government, ensuring transparent and fair housing practices. The committee, diverse in age, race, and background, became a model for other neighborhoods looking to promote equality and inclusion. Carlos, who had once felt like an outsider in his own neighborhood, now found himself as a respected community leader. He was invited to speak at schools and community centers, sharing the story of Maple Street's transformation and inspiring others to take a stand against discrimination. One crisp autumn evening, as Carlos walked home from one such speaking engagement, he paused at the entrance to Maple Street. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the houses, and the sound of children playing drifted on the breeze. He thought back to that fateful 4th of July barbecue that had set everything in motion. Deep in thought, a voice asked. Carlos turned to see Maria walking up, hand in hand with Mrs. Chen. "Just appreciating how far we've come," Carlos replied with a smile. Mrs. Chen nodded sagely. "And yet, our journey is far from over. There will always be more work to do, more bridges to build. But we'll do it together," Maria added, squeezing Mrs. Chen's hand. As they walked down the street, neighbors called out greetings. The Fosters were helping the newly arrived Paddle family unpack their moving truck. Alex and his friends were planning their next community service project on the Johnsons' front steps. And there, tending to a small garden in front of his house, was Harold Thompson, working alongside Eleanor and a group of enthusiastic children. Carlos felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the evening sun. This was what community meant, not just living side by side, but truly seeing and supporting one another through good times and bad. As they reached their own front yard, Carlos noticed a small package on the porch. Opening it, he found a framed photograph of the multicultural festival with a note attached. To the residents of Maple Street, your courage and compassion have shown us all what's possible when we stand together against hate. Thank you for leading the way. Diana Chen. Carlos handed the frame to Maria, who studied it with misty eyes. We should hang this in the community center, she said, to remind us of how far we've come and to inspire us to keep going. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. Every great journey begins with a single step. Maple Street has taken many steps forward, but our path stretches on. There will be challenges ahead, no doubt, but now we know the strength we possess when we stand united. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Carlos looked out at his neighborhood, at the faces of friends and allies where once he had seen only strangers and adversaries. He thought of all the stories yet to be told, all the connections yet to be made. You're right, he said, putting an arm around Maria and smiling at Mrs. Chen. Our journey isn't over, but whatever comes next, we'll face it the way we faced everything else, together. And with that, they walked into their home, leaving the door open and welcome, ready for whatever the future might bring to Maple Street, a place that had become more than just a neighborhood. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of unity, and a reminder that with courage, compassion, and understanding, even the deepest divisions can be healed. As night fell on Maple Street, the warm glow of porch lights illuminated a community forever changed. Not perfect, but ever striving, ever growing, and above all, ever welcoming to all who sought to call it home.